This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be jumping into the world right after World War II.
Oh, yeah.
It's a fascinating time, right?
Definitely.
Like so much change happening. And we're really going to focus on President Roosevelt's impact on it all, his diplomatic legacy. And we're going to be using this super interesting Mercury podcast episode as our kind of guide for today.
Oh, cool.
It's called Diplomatic Shifts and Roosevelt's Legacy After World War II.
Catchy.
Yeah. And it's from Mr. Hutchings History.
Yeah.
So it's really about how the world was reshaped.
Right.
And how the U.S. suddenly became, well, a superpower. I mean, it is kind of hard to imagine the U.S. not being a global superpower. But it really wasn't always that way, was it?
Not at all. World War II totally changed everything.
Yeah. And that's what we're going to dig into.
Exactly.
Like how much of that was because of Roosevelt? And, the big question was his approach to Stalin. Brilliant. Or did it kind of backfire and lead us straight into the Cold War?
Yeah, big questions. It's a period that's caused so much debate. Historians are still arguing about it.
Oh, bad.
But one thing everyone agrees on.
What's that?
World War II, it catapulted the U.S. onto the world stage.
Yeah, before that, the U.S. was kind of...
Isolated?
Yeah, off doing its own thing. But suddenly...
Leading the charge.
Right. And it wasn't just because we won the war.
Nope.
The episode talks about how the U.S. had a hand in, rebuilding Europe and Asia and even starting the United Nations.
Huge.
Huge.
All signs of a new global power.
It's almost like they were forced into the spotlight.
Yeah.
All right, U.S., it's your turn now.
Yeah, kind of. And the thing is, Roosevelt wasn't just interested in power,
Yeah.
He really, truly believed in democracy. He wanted it to be the model for the whole world.
Oh, wow. So a world where everyone's getting along and cooperating.
Just a dream. He saw institutions, like the UN as the way to make that happen, prevent future wars and all that.
That's pretty idealistic. Thinking that something like the UN could actually... work. I mean, look at the world today.
You're not wrong. And it makes his relationship with Stalin even more interesting, right?
Right. It's here's this guy, Roosevelt, who's all about democracy and peace, and then he teams up with Stalin, the communist dictator. What? How does that even make sense?
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher for sure. But the episode explains that for Roosevelt, it was a matter of, survival. They had to defeat Hitler, and to do that, they needed Stalin. He was a crucial ally.
So sometimes you got to make deals with the devil, huh? Even if that devil is a communist dictator.
I guess so, especially during a world war.
Okay, I get the logic.
Yeah.
But I'm guessing not everyone was thrilled with this whole team up with Stalin thing?
Oh, not at all. Historians have been arguing about it for, ever. Some say Roosevelt was way too trusting of Stalin. He genuinely thought he could, bring the Soviet Union into this whole peaceful, democratic world.
Through the UN.
Yeah. They think he believed in the power of diplomacy, to change even a guy like Stalin.
Well, we know how that turned out.
Yeah.
Cold War and all. Sounds a little naive now, doesn't it?
Yeah, in hindsight. And that's what some historians point to. They're like, Roosevelt totally underestimated Stalin's ambitions, especially in Eastern Europe. They say that by the time of the Yalta Conference, Stalin was already, making moves to control those countries.
Hold on. The Yalta Conference? That was where the Allies were figuring out the whole post-war world,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
So these historians are saying that Stalin was already calling the shots in Eastern Europe. And that Roosevelt should have been tougher, pushed back more.
Yep. They think he was too hesitant to confront Stalin directly, especially on issues like Poland's independence. They say it basically gave the Soviet Union a free pass to expand its influence.
Wow. That's a heavy accusation. Makes you wonder, what would happen if Roosevelt hadn't died just before the war ended?
Right. It's a huge what if in history. What if he had lived? Would he have used his diplomatic skills, his relationship with Stalin, to keep that wartime alliance going?
Yeah. Could he have, prevented the Cold War?
Maybe. Or at least, soften the blow.
Man, it's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
He was pretty good at mediating between, strong personalities.
Yeah.
Like Stalin and Churchill.
It was.
So maybe he could have navigated the post-war world, too.
Yeah.
Kept things from, completely falling apart.
It's possible. But there's also the argument that the Cold War was unavoidable.
Oh, right, that no matter what Roosevelt did, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were just too different.
Exactly. Two completely opposed systems, capitalism versus communism, like oil and water.
So even with the best diplomat in the world, those tensions were just going to explode sooner or later.
That's what some historians believe.
Man, that's kind of depressing, huh? Like a ticking time bomb no matter what.
It is a bit.
But here's the thing. Cold War or not, the U.S. still came out of World War II as, well, the superpower.
Yeah. From reluctant giant to leader of the free world.
And it happened so fast.
It really did. But it wasn't just luck. You know, the episode talks about how it was a combination of things.
Okay, so, like, what were the ingredients in this superpower recipe? Obviously, winning the war helped, but there had to be more to it, right?
Definitely. Military strength was one thing, but the U.S. economy was booming, and they were taking on this new leadership role in, well, global affairs.
So it wasn't just about military might, it was about, like, influence.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So what were some of the specific things the U.S. did to become, like, the superpower?
Okay, well, obviously defeating fascism was huge, but there was also the way the U.S. presented itself, you know, as a champion of democracy, of freedom, especially after what happened with Nazi Germany.
Right, so it's kind of like, look at us, we're the good guys. We fight for freedom.
Yeah, exactly. It was a mix of hard power and soft power.
Military muscle and the power of ideas. Okay, I can see how that would be persuasive.
Totally. And then there's the UN. The U.S. was a major player in creating that, which, you know, kind of solidified their position as a leader in global diplomacy.
So we have defeating fascism, promoting democracy, establishing the UN.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Oh, there's more. The episode also talks about the Bretton Woods system, which basically set up the rules for the global economy after the war. And then there was the Marshall Plan.
Oh, yeah, the Marshall Plan. Wasn't that where the U.S., like, pumped a ton of money into rebuilding Europe?
Exactly. A massive aid program. It was really generous of them, considering they had just come out of a devastating war themselves.
Yeah. So the U.S. was basically showing off its power in, like, every way possible. Military, economic, diplomatic.
They were flexing their muscles, for sure.
But even with all that, the tension with the Soviet Union was still there, wasn't it? Like, simmering under the surface.
Yeah, it was. Despite all the talk of cooperation and a new world order, that ideological divide was just too deep.
It's like they built this amazing house, but forgot about the giant crack in the foundation.
It's a good analogy.
So even as the U.S. was celebrating its victories, the Cold War was already brewing.
Unfortunately, yeah. Those seeds of distrust, they were already planted.
So it was a time of, like, triumph, but also worry.
Exactly. A really fascinating but kind of tragic moment in history.
I'm hooked. This is intense.
It is. And we're just getting started.
Oh, there's more.
Definitely.
I'm ready.
All right, let's take a quick breath, though. Let our listener absorb all this. We've covered a lot of ground.
Good point. But we'll be back in a flash to continue this deep dive into Roosevelt's legacy. Don't go anywhere. All right, welcome back. I don't know about you, but my brain is still buzzing from all that stuff we talked about in the first part.
It's a lot to take in, for sure.
Roosevelt, Stalin, the U.S. becoming a superpower. It's like a whole season of a TV show crammed into, like, 20 minutes.
And it seems like our listeners are particularly fascinated by this idea that maybe, just maybe, Roosevelt could have, like, stopped the Cold War from happening.
Yeah, if he'd lived longer, that's a big what if.
It is. And of course, the episode we're looking at, it doesn't give us a definitive answer. History is messy like that.
Right, no crystal balls.
Yeah.
But it does lay out some interesting possibilities.
Definitely. Like, one scenario is that Roosevelt, you know, with his connection to Stalin and all that experience mediating during the war, he might have been able to keep that U.S.-Soviet alliance going, at least for a while.
So instead of things like instantly falling apart after the war, it could have been a more gradual shift.
Exactly. Less confrontational, maybe. Imagine Roosevelt at the Potsdam Conference, you know, with Truman and Stalin.
Ooh, that's a good one. Do you think he could have smoothed things over, prevented some of those disagreements that really got the Cold War going?
It's possible. He was pretty good at handling those big personalities.
He was a master at it. But the episode also brings up the opposite view, right?
Right. That the Cold War was kind of inevitable.
No matter what.
Some historians argue that. They say it was all about these fundamental differences between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, like their whole ideologies, capitalism versus communism. No way to reconcile those.
It's like two cars heading straight for each other no matter who's driving.
That's a good way to put it. It was a clash of systems, you know. Both the U.S. and the Soviets, they wanted to shape the world in their own image. And those visions were totally incompatible.
So even with someone like Roosevelt at the wheel, things are going to crash eventually.
That's the argument. Yeah, it's not just about personalities. It's about these bigger historical forces.
Okay, I get it. But even if we can't, like, blame the Cold War on Roosevelt, his decisions still had an impact, right?
Sure, for sure. Even if the Cold War was, like, destined to happen, the way it played out, the specific events, those were shaped by the people in charge, including Roosevelt.
So we're not letting him off the hook completely. It's
Yeah,
just interesting to think that maybe there were things even he couldn't control.
Exactly. It adds another layer to the whole story, doesn't it?
It does. It's like it wasn't all on him.
No.
But okay, even with the Cold War looming, the U.S. still came out of World War II as this, like, global powerhouse.
Absolutely. It's amazing how quickly that happened.
Yeah. One minute they're this, like, reluctant giant, and the next they're leading the free world. Like, what happened?
The episode actually points to a few key factors. And it wasn't just about winning the war, you know? It was about how they won it.
Okay, remind me. What were some of those things that made the U.S. a superpower?
Well, obviously defeating fascism was huge. But the U.S. also really emphasized, you know, their role as a champion of democracy and freedom, especially compared to, like, Nazi Germany.
Right, so it was about more than just military power. It was about values.
Exactly. And people were looking to the U.S. for leadership. They wanted a better world after all that, you know, horror. And the U.S., they stepped up.
I can see how that would resonate with people. Okay, so we've got defeating fascism, being the good guys. What else?
Well, there was the whole UN thing. The U.S. was super involved in creating that. It showed they were committed to, like, international cooperation, finding peaceful solutions.
Makes sense. So they're leading the charge on the world stage, literally. What else?
The episode also mentions the Bretton Woods system, which it's complicated, but basically it set up the framework for the global economy after the war, with the U.S. dollar at the center of it all.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
So economic power, too. And then there was the Marshall Plan, right?
Yes, where the U.S. gave tons of aid to help rebuild Europe.
That was pretty huge, especially considering the U.S. had just been through a war themselves.
It was a massive investment.
So the U.S. was basically showing everyone that they were, like, the benevolent superpower.
Yeah.
Helping out, rebuilding.
It definitely gave them a boost, image-wise. But it wasn't just about being nice, of course.
Oh, right. There was a strategic side to it, too.
Definitely. Helping Europe recover also meant, you know, preventing the spread of Soviet influence.
So 2 birds, 1 stone, smart. But even with all that good stuff going on, that Cold War tension, it was still there, wasn't it?
It was, sadly. As much as people talked about cooperation and a new world order, the U.S. and the Soviets, they just couldn't see eye to eye.
It's like all that hope and optimism from the war, it just started fading away.
It's a shame, but it's true.
So it's like the U.S. is on top of the world, but there's this, like, dark cloud hanging over everything.
Exactly. Triumph and uncertainty all mixed together.
It's giving me, like, historical whiplash.
I know what you mean, but that's what makes this period so fascinating, right?
It does. It's a reminder that history, it's never simple. There are always these contradictions, these layers.
And that's what we're trying to explore in this deep dive, the good, the bad, and the complicated.
Well, you're doing a great job. I'm learning so much.
Glad to hear it.
Okay, I need a minute to process all this. This is heavy stuff.
Let's take a quick break, give our listener a chance to catch their breath too.
All right, we're back. And wow, we are deep in the weeds of Roosevelt's legacy now, huh?
We are. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has. From teaming up with Stalin to the U.S. suddenly becoming a superpower to the whole Cold War thing looming in the background. It's a lot.
And through it all, we've been trying to figure out, like, what were Roosevelt's moves? Were they the right moves? Was he too trusting? Could he have stopped the Cold War?
Yeah, those are the million-dollar questions.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said before, historians have been going back and forth about it for decades.
Oh, yeah. The episode we've been digging into, it lays out all those different perspectives.
Yeah.
You know, the orthodox view, then the revisionists come in, and then there's the post-revisionists.
It's like a whole history lesson in itself.
Yeah.
Just trying to understand how historians interpret things.
It is. But it's important, right? Because it reminds us that history isn't always black and white.
Right. There's not always one right answer.
Exactly. It's about looking at the different arguments, the evidence, and then, you know, forming your own informed opinion.
Okay, so let's go back to those different views one more time, just to make sure we're all on the same page. First up, we have the orthodox historians. They're basically the ones who see Roosevelt in a more positive light, right?
Yeah, they're more forgiving, I guess you could say. They see his partnership with Stalin as, like, a necessary evil. They had to defeat Hitler, and they believe that Roosevelt actually thought that cooperation could continue after the war.
So they see him as a guy who is both like realistic and idealistic, trying to balance, winning the war with building a better world.
Exactly. And they point to the UN as like a proof of that. That was his vision, right? A world where countries work together, solve problems peacefully.
Okay, I could see that. But then, as the Cold War gets going, a new group of historians come along, the revisionists.
Right. And they're much tougher on Roosevelt. They basically say he was naive to trust Stalin, that he didn't see Stalin's true intentions, especially in Eastern Europe.
And they think that Roosevelt should have put his foot down more, like at Yalta.
Yeah, they see those compromises he made with Stalin as a big mistake. Like, it opened the door for the Soviets to take over Eastern Europe, which led to the Cold War and all that.
So they're putting a lot of the blame for the Cold War on Roosevelt's shoulders.
They are. They think his idealism basically blinded him to the reality of, what Stalin was really up to.
Okay, so we have the optimists and the pessimists. But then things get even more interesting, right, with the post-revisionists.
Right. They come along and they're like, hold on, let's not get too carried away. They bring a more balanced perspective.
So they're not totally bashing Roosevelt, but they're not giving him a free pass either.
Exactly. They're saying, look, even if Roosevelt had played his cards differently, the Cold War probably still would have happened.
Because the U.S. and the Soviet Union were just too different.
Right. They see it as this clash of systems, of ideologies. That was kind of inevitable.
Like, no matter who was president, those two superpowers were going to butt heads eventually.
That's their argument. And they also point to the fact that, it wasn't just about Roosevelt. Domestic politics played a role, public opinion. It was complicated.
So it's not just about one guy or even one decision. It's about all these different factors colliding, which honestly makes it even more interesting to think about.
I agree. And that brings us back to, the big question. What's Roosevelt's legacy? Was he a hero who tried to build a better world? Or was he like a naive leader who made mistakes that led to the Cold War?
Or maybe, like the post-revisionists say, he was just a guy caught in the middle of, history happening, doing the best he could with what he had.
Right. It's a tough one. And like we've been saying, there's no easy answer. History is full of these gray areas.
But that's what makes it so fascinating to explore.
Absolutely. It's not about finding the one right answer. It's about asking the questions, looking at the evidence, and, forming our own conclusions.
It's like being a detective, but for history.
Exactly. And that's what we've tried to do in this deep dive. Present the information, show you the different ways of looking at it, and hopefully get you thinking.
Well, mission accomplished. I feel like I have a much better understanding of this whole period, even if there are still a lot of unanswered questions.
And that's okay. Those unanswered questions, they're what keep us curious, keep us learning.
They do. So we've talked about Roosevelt's vision for the world, the tough choices he had to make, and the impact those choices had, even if some of them weren't what he intended.
It's a story that reminds us how complicated leadership can be, and how even the best intentions can sometimes lead to unintended consequences.
It's a lot to take in, but it's so important to understand this stuff because it shapes the world we live in today.
Couldn't agree more.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one last thought. Imagine you're in Roosevelt's shoes. You've just won a world war, but now you're facing a whole new set of challenges. What do you do?
What compromises do you make? What risks do you take?
It's a question worth thinking about, not just for historians, but for all of us. Because, in a way, we're all still dealing with the legacy of those decisions made all those years ago. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going. Because that's how we learn from the past and hopefully build a better future. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.